Characters define stories and give them the meaning and emotion that make those stories stick with us for years afterward. And that, of course, isn't possible without those characters having complex relationships. While they maybe seem simple to write on the outset, relationships are easy to make fun but difficult to make fulfilling. And in the end, they are endlessly complex, so we're going to try and narrow down a few common types of relationships you might see while writing, and discuss some ideas on how to get them across effectively while still allowing each character's unique traits to shine through. This video is a pretty broad overview of an endlessly complex topic, so videos to follow on this general theme may be forthcoming, depending on what you guys want. But I think the most appropriate one to start with, since it usually is a very early story type of relationship, is part 1, Apprentices and Mentors. So assuming you've accomplished one of the first steps of any writing project, which is to make a likable character, making a mentor for that character about as likable comes fairly naturally. Despite the fact that mentors probably have the highest mortality rate of any character archetype, other than the generic goon, good mentors get the audience attached simply because most people like wise and helpful individuals. The problem, of course, comes with actually writing someone who is wise, or at least knowledgeable, because a character is only as wise or knowledgeable as their writer. So the nature of this is going to depend on the particular situation, and it's outside the scope of this video, though I could make one on how to write mentors. But our focus today is on how they will interact with their apprentices and vice versa. And generally, in fiction, that dynamic is defined, even if not entirely consciously in all cases, by the slightly apocryphal Freudian maxim that a boy does not become a man until his father dies. Regardless of how you think that idea interacts with reality, it applies pretty strongly to fiction. The apprentice will never reach their full potential so long as they maintain the dynamic of their relationship with their mentor. Most often, as is said by the mortality rate comment, this comes with the mentor dying. The obvious example would be in the original Star Wars movies, where this happens twice, first with Obi-Wan and then with Master Yoda later. Obi-Wan's death precedes Luke blowing up the Death Star and trusting in the Force, whereas Yoda's death precedes Luke being able to face Vader and stand a chance at either redeeming or defeating him. Of course, you don't have to actually kill the mentor, who sometimes is the protagonist's actual parent, to achieve this effect. A good example there might be Morpheus from The Matrix, who I'd say slots pretty well into the mentor role, but he doesn't actually die. Neo just surpasses him, and importantly, their dynamic changes. Morpheus goes from a character who is in the know relative to a clueless Neo, to one who is operating on even terms with him as Neo comes to understand his situation. For this reason, we can discuss mentors in their pre-death and post-death states, even if such death is metaphorical. Pre-death, the general vibe of these relationships is always going to be that the mentor has more to say to the apprentice always. That there are infinite lessons and stories that the audience knows the apprentice will never get to hear all of. This is pretty important, even though it's not necessarily the first thing you think about. Mentors can be these nice old grandparent-y types, or they can be grumpy and reluctant to aid the apprentice, though generally, given the fact that this mentor has to be bothered to actually teach the apprentice something, they will be motivated in some way to help that apprentice, and thus often become ingratiated to them. It is generally for this reason that we tend to love mentors, even those we know will die. I mean, aside from the ones I've already mentioned, we've got everyone from Gandalf and Dumbledore to Three Houses Geralt, and even characters like Virgil from Dante's Inferno. And these are all almost universally loved characters. And I think this results from the fact that mentors themselves have to be carefully done for 3 reasons. They'll be very present very early on. The audience knows they'll probably die and won't care about that if they don't like them. And they have to actually directly contribute to the apprentice's success in a way other characters might not. Then, at the time of their death, literal or not, of the mentor, this dynamic will change. There's almost always the sense that, as mentioned earlier, there are many things the apprentice is yet to learn, which is especially going to be the case if that mentor actually does die. If they do, it'll usually be in some self-sacrificial way, because it's a very natural conclusion to that kind of character arc. If they don't actually perish, then it should almost always be the case that 1, the mentor will take much more of a back seat in the plot, as there still needs to be this point in which the dynamic changes, and 2, They should become an equal to the protagonist, even if they don't know the same amount of things. And even if the mentor is still stronger, they should come to treat the apprentice more as a peer than they were doing so before. To conclude this segment, I'll say this, as I will for most of these categories. If you've never done this before, write about a relationship you know. If you have someone in your life you think of as a mentor, try and write an interaction between a character like you and a character like them. And that will give you a bit more of a feel for that dynamic written down in the sort of ways that you might talk to each other. However, there are a lot of relationship types, so we're going to move on right away to part 2, friends, pals, and good old chums. Writing good friendships is a surefire way to get people to love your work and for the Tumblr people to write homoerotic ships. Whether you want that or not, it is a good sign you're doing well. In either case, writing friendships, I find, comes fairly naturally to most people. And that's because they are incredibly varied, because people can be friends for any number of reasons. From having gone through incredible trauma together to sharing a same favorite ice cream flavor. If you like maple walnut ice cream, we would probably be friends. The other reason they come naturally is because people tend to write the friendship dynamics that they know from their real life, and these often end up being the strongest parts of character writing coming from novice writers. And I encourage you to write like that, especially at first. They say you should write what you know, and transplanting those fun and unique friendships you might really have is going to lend an authentic tone to your writing. The main thing to be aware of when doing this is to be willing to adjust it for the actual context of your story. You might be using a familiar type of friendship in a story, but it'll be a little different in a story that's about, say, a pleasant and kid-friendly adventure across a magical land than it would be in a horror story in which one of those two characters gets brutally eviscerated halfway through. You can go too far with replicating dynamics, and they can stick out as not fitting if they aren't considering the actual way in which the characters present should be acting. This is also not saying to write self-inserts. It's a tendency that goes well basically none of the time. However, every character you write is in some way a part of you, the writer, so those ways of communication that occur to you naturally will just be the way that your character speaks, so if nothing else, write characters that are like yourself, not characters that are yourself. You also want to consider how to sell a friendship to an audience, especially in cases where you want it to be established already by the time the audience even meets these characters. The classic noodle incident trope is an effective and simple way to pull this off. If you haven't heard that term before, you'll still be familiar with the idea. It's that whole scene where you've got two characters who are friends and they're with a third person, and the friends say, "Oh, you better not tell them about that thing with the tire swing." You don't have to elaborate on what exactly that thing with the tire swing is for it to be clear to the audience that those two know each other well. In fact, it's usually better that you never do elaborate on what that incident was. And when you start becoming aware of the noodle incident trope, you will start seeing it everywhere. There are more subtle and probably better ways of doing this too, primarily from contrasting the ways in which your characters as friends interact. They might be on the same page sooner, understand one another's emotions better, that sort of thing that just sort of happens with friendships when people know each other well that nobody consciously thinks about. That intuitive understanding between them can say a lot without you ever having to directly call attention to it. And trust your readers with even weirder things too. Friends banter, they insult each other, and say things either one would rightly hate anyone else for saying to them. It's just the way friendships tend to work because they will support each other when it actually matters. My editor and I call each other idiots and worse all the time, but anyone watching us interact would know we're great friends. And the same should be the case of any friendships that you write. After that, we have the closely related category, part 3, rivals. Rivals are a fairly specific type of character relationship, but they often dominate the stories they are present in, and when done well, can be one of the most beloved forms of interaction one might write. They can take all sorts of forms too, because rivals don't have to be enemies. They can be, but they can also be friends whose naturally competitive nature leads them to try and outdo one another. One thing they are for sure is extremely useful as a tool for the writer, because they give the protagonist something that even good villains don't really do, given the asymmetric nature of that relationship, and that is a mirror for the protagonist to compare themselves to. To take everyone on YouTube's favorite example, Let's talk about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Zuko acts as a mirror to Aang in ways that Fire Lord Ozai never could be. Where the Fire Lord is a distant, aloof figure who doesn't interact with Aang basically at all, we follow Zuko's story almost as much as we follow Aang, to the point that you could just about argue Zuko is the show's deuteragonist, or even secondary protagonist. I would, but he's my favorite character, which I know is a super unique opinion. Zuko also represents both of the two primary types of rivals. Those who grow in the opposite direction of the protagonist, and those who grow in parallel to the protagonist. In both cases, they tend to get more powerful and/or competent as the protagonist does, which isn't a given for a lot of other character archetypes, even if the rival's growth won't be as on screen as the protagonist's. Oftentimes a good rival will almost follow the same rules a protagonist does, depending on how major their role in the story is anyway. It's fairly simple if they're an ally, as they'll often be there at the same time as the protagonist, but even if they're working against the protagonist, they'll tend to variably thwart one another until the inevitable final confrontation. However, the thing that really tends to define these as character dynamics is the way in which they mirror each other. Typically, an allied rival will be a mirror in the sense that they are strong where the protagonist is weak, and vice versa, whereas an actual hostile rival will typically be drawn closer in these regards. Essentially, rivals are typically close in opinion or close in capability to the protagonist they mirror, but it's usually not neither, or they no longer are really a rival, and it usually isn't both, or they become too similar to the protagonist. Since this is a fairly big picture video, there isn't much else I'll say for the sake of not getting too far into the weeds, but suffice it to say, rivalries are very fun and very narrative defining. But now we'll move on to one of the biggest dynamics, and probably the one you thought of first when relationships was the title, and that's part 4, lovers. Romance is at least an aspect of, I would dare to say, probably a majority of all stories ever written. Whether it's in the fairly passive and then those two smooched to end a story, or the more active, complex courtship that lasts throughout, romance, being a fairly major part of many people's lives, becomes a fairly major part of stories. Even those that are not in any way primarily about romance. Every type of story has it, from James Bond to Blade Runner. You don't need it, don't write it if you don't want it, but when it's present, you want to try and get it right. It's another one of those things made easier by real-life experiences, which really is true with anything you write about, but you can replicate your own dynamics in that way, much like you could with friendships. But the important thing is that romantic dynamics have a lot in common with friendship dynamics. Such characters might interact in identical ways, especially since many romance plotlines begin as friendships, or even rivalries. However, the key difference is the underlying tension, the steam waiting to scream out from the kettle that keeps people hooked. And it's also why pre-existing relationships amongst primary characters, especially in the first part of any story, are pretty likely to end, at least temporarily, or not exist at all until later on. While in an actual romance story, this sort of tension will be defining it, even largely non-romantic stories that just have subplots of it will still benefit from that tension. A great example here would be The X-Files, at least for the first several seasons. It really maintained an excellent balance in the relationship between Scully and Mulder that was basically the peak of will they or won't they? Because while it was obvious they cared about one another, they still quarreled and didn't really take direct actions that implied they were actually together. And this ended up being one of the selling points of the show to a fair amount of people. And even to those who it wasn't, it was still an effective part of their otherwise good dynamic. Now, romance is so overwhelmingly present that it, more than any other type of thing that can happen in writing, is tied up with tropes. You don't want to hallmark yourself, where you can guess exactly how things will go as soon as they start. You know how that story goes. Couple meets, but one is unavailable because of a previous relationship or obligation. But they like each other, so they go out sometimes, but it isn't really a date. Then they actually kinda get together, have a fight or some circumstances tear them apart. Then in the final hour, they get back together and live happily ever after. So unless you're aiming for Hallmark or a slot on the romance section of your local Books A Million, you probably want to subvert those tropes if you do intend to actually see the romance through to success. Or if nothing else, have the characters be unique enough that it being tropey isn't a problem. And of course, you don't have to do that either. It's about as common when we're talking about non-romance stories for a lover in that story to either be the subject of some sort of kidnapping or even to be killed. It's here where some writers kind of trip up, is maybe the best way to say it, and you risk pulling a fridging, which is to say killing off a character that is important to the protagonist but not to the audience, and making the focus of the tragedy of that death not be on the actual person who died, but the person who's mourning them. It often doesn't really come off very well. Then, of course, should the lover be kidnapped, there's the ever-present damsel in distress trope that people are generally pretty tired of. So ultimately, writing lovers does end up tricky because it's so easy for them to be a point of bad tropiness, though there can be good tropiness, even in an otherwise fairly unique tale, if only because there are so many tropes to compare your iteration with. However, maintaining that tension, as I keep repeating, whatever form that might take, in that relationship, and allowing both characters to not be defined by the fact they're part of a romantic dynamic, might set you in the right direction. And then there's also the whole love triangle thing. That's another one people are pretty sick of. But if you're writing YA, I do think someone will probably come to your house and shoot you if you don't include one, so I'd keep that in mind. Anyway, the last dynamic, and the biggest perhaps, is part 5, Heroes and Villains. This is a very broad video, as I've said before, and there's not a chance I can cover everything there is to say about heroes and villains interactions, because those are kind of the most important characters in any story. So rather than explain in uselessly broad terms, I'll instead focus on the key parts of this dynamic, namely the power of the fundamental philosophical differences between a hero and a villain and how that defines their interactions. While villains can be strong by themselves, even if they and the hero don't have all that much to say to one another, much of the dynamic between an antagonist and a protagonist is in what each of them represent. And for this, I'll use an example of a story in which the protagonist and antagonist never even actually directly speak to each other, yet still have a powerful dynamic through the way in which you compare them. So, No Country for Old Men. You might think that Llewellyn Moss is the protagonist, but I would argue it's Ed Tom Bell, the old sheriff, who is thusly compared to Anton Chigurh. You might say, but J-Bat, how can they have a dynamic if they never even see each other? And I would say it is because they represent fundamentally different forces in the world, and figuring this out leads to the actual theme of the story. I'm saying story because it's true for the novel and the movie, but as it were, it is your villains and your heroes that actually demonstrate what your narrative is really about, when done well. So Anton Chigurh is the epitome, in my opinion anyway, of pure random acts of evil and chaos in the world. By certain interpretations, he almost isn't even a real person, it's just an emissary of the crimes and death that Bell witnesses. He's principled, adhering strictly to a code that anyone who sees him and knows him for what he is must die, and the best he can do for those who plead for their lives is offer a coin flip, the surest form of chance. Meanwhile, Bell is comparatively extremely normal. He's just an old cop who, for most of his tenure, didn't have all that much going on in terms of violent crime. He observes the worsening conditions and comes to the conclusion by the end of the story, still never having seen Chigurh and having no idea he got hit by a car and may well be dead, that the world is becoming a fundamentally worse place. Yet when he expresses this to his uncle Ellis, he finds out that the world isn't any different than it ever was. The people aren't any different. It's just how the world is. It's in this way Chigurh becomes an expression of the novel's theme. Even if he specifically isn't real, whatever that means, he's representative of the sort of wanton, cruel, pointless violence humanity is capable of inflicting on itself. And it's only held back by the efforts of men like Bell. Even they, being mere men, fail to save the world. It is only that type of person that stands any chance to hold back the darkness. All this, and never were these two men in the same place at the same time. Not even in that famous scene, I don't think. So while in all other ways the dynamic between protag and antag might vary, this key thing, the way the story portrays them, illustrating their fundamental differences, is the most important thing to keep in mind, whether or not that relationship they have is verbal or otherwise. So with all that in mind, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts of your own about writing relationships or other dynamics that are worth talking about, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way for us. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons: Shadowrunner, Sawney, Isaac Parrott, who are our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, the world ain't all waiting on you. That's vanity. So get writing.